All right, welcome to Bigfoot's Wilderness. Our encounter story for today is called The Bigfoot Incident. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Any kid with an imagination loves a mystery, and I know I was like most other boys my age that had an obsession with mysterious monsters. I'm pretty sure that somewhere in my mother's attic there's still a cardboard box filled to the brim with Bigfoot books. I never threw anything away. I do think my age predates the word cryptid, but the fact that there were hidden creatures made me believe that they could in fact be anywhere, hiding, maybe even in my neck of the woods in Virginia. Bigfoot was my main interest, maybe because he seemed more human-like, walked bipedally, probably living with a group or family of other Bigfoot. It seemed possible in my opinion. And then, like all kids, I grew up. I took on other interests. Bigfoot was put back in storage, mentally and physically, for decades, until, of course, just recently. As a father, and having a family, we decided to try something different for a spring break. I had reserved a cabin on the opposite side of our state. My wife and I wanted to change up the experience and add more of a physical aspect to our excursion. There were hiking paths around the cabin and a swimming pool close to town, not to mention shopping less than an hour away. With our kids, it seemed almost impossible to get them away from their phone screens. Once we arrived and unpacked, my son and I walked down to one of the shorter trails to get acquainted with the area. We soon found ourselves standing at the edge of a large pool fed by a quick-moving stream, just admiring the beauty. A few moments later, above the sound of the stream, I thought I heard talking, or was it mumbling? It seemed to be coming from the other side of the pool, just inside the woodline. I asked my son if he heard it too. At times, it would be quite loud and then go silent. We looked for movement, but saw nothing. And then something caught my eye along the banks of the stream, something almost out of place. It was a lone footprint, and very noticeable at that. I stepped across the rocks and just stared at it. Its appearance was broad and flat. It was smaller than my foot, at about 9.5 inches. I happened to wear a size 14 shoe, but for scale I compared it to my knife, and yet the foot was wider than my own by at least an inch. I could see that the big toe was the last digit lifted before entering the stream. I looked around and wondered. Logic alone told me we were at least a half mile from any other neighbor and on private land. The owner was a friend and mentioned earlier that the house had been unoccupied for several weeks. My son was back to skipping rocks again, seemingly bored with what we found. I, on the other hand, was very interested and took a picture of the print with my phone, and we both walked back to the house. I showed my wife the picture, but she didn't seem to really notice the details that I had. She thought I was presuming too much out of a single print, and maybe I had. Later that day, after returning from town, I decided to just hike around by myself. Nothing too far. I just thought I'd check out the very large hill behind the cabin. Returning, I stopped at the car to change my shoes. I pressed the remote to open the hatch, and like most cars, the sensor beeps. As I finished changing shoes and pressed the remote again, I began hearing what I could say were ape sounds, and it sounded like this. Ooh, 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 and repeated again. I had goosebumps as the volume of the vocals almost seemed to be right next to me. As the same noise repeated again, I tried to locate the source. I was certain it was from the hill I had just explored, but the trees and foliage were dense, and that made it hard to see anything. I calmly turned around and walked away and into the cabin. Is it possible I was being pranked by my kids? I wondered at first, but they didn't confess, nor did they seem to have any interest in what I had just experienced. I was pretty sure that the noises originated from the hillside. I keep calling it a hillside because it wasn't necessarily a mountain, but there was substantial elevation if you were to climb to the top. I'd say close to 300 feet. It may sound like I was a little slow to connect the dots, but trust me, things were swirling in the back of my mind. Was it possible? Were the books that I read so long ago factual? I'm here in Virginia, not the Pacific Northwest. That evening, we left for dinner and a movie, arriving back at the cabin at about 11 p.m. I had to say, I was a little concerned about the trip back, as the private road used off the main road was treacherous during the day, so at night this was going to be challenging. The private road was fairly new, with chunks of dirt, rock, and gravel. Part of that hillside had been plowed through by some heavy machinery, enough so to barely give us the wide berth we needed to obtain access to the cabin in our SUV. Each time we returned to the cabin, I'd have to make a 3-point turn so the car pointed back out towards the exit. But tonight was different. As soon as we stopped the car, I just got that feeling of being watched. I thought the kids could feel it too as they turned on the phone's flashlight and ran around the side of the cabin to open the front door. And me? Well, I had to calmly face that fear as my wife collected some trash from the back seat and grabbed her purse. "Why don't you just leave it? We can get it in the morning," I said. "Well, I'm here now. Just give me a second." So as I stood there, I tried scanning the woods and hillside with my phone's flashlight. By the way, a tip to those of you out there like me that think your phone is a veritable Swiss Army knife: it's not. The flashlight is useless. Another 30 seconds and we were both finally headed for the front door. I wrestled with the handle, unaware at first that it was locked. I kept my composure and knocked on the door as the kids unlocked it. "Why did you lock the door? You knew we were coming in." "Because it's creepy out there." Did you see something?" "No, it just felt creepy." And that's exactly how I felt as well. I tried to dismiss it, but as I sat in the living room, which by the way sat in the middle of the house and directly faced the front door, I continued to get the feeling of being watched. The door was mostly insulated glass, and since there weren't any blinds or shades, I tried covering it up with my hoodie and towel. I just felt the need to cover it up. It made me feel a little better. I slept sporadically on our last night. I would hear a noise, any noise, and try to analyze it. Was that a dog barking or yelping? I waited for sunrise. My nerves were frayed. That morning, I woke up the kids and made a quick breakfast. I just wanted to go home. I felt exhausted. As I carried our bags to the car, something caught my eye at about 30 to 35 yards, which happened to be directly out the front door. The cabin was elevated and sat on a gravel landing that overlooked a small clearing, and beyond that, woods and a creek. I walked to the edge of the landing as I could see something dark brown and black. It appeared to be in a sitting position and slightly covered by some foliage. I quietly walked back into the cabin and asked my wife if she could see it too. She did see it, but dismissed it as a stump or broken tree. "It doesn't look like a tree in any way," I argued back. "Well, if you're so curious, why don't you go down there and get a closer look?" She countered. "Not unless I've got a gun with me, in which case I don't." She had no idea what I was thinking, and for a good reason. If this truly was a Bigfoot, as I had concluded from the past few days of evidence, I didn't want to frighten her or the children. I did snap a few pictures from the doorway with my phone. The entire time, as I started to put the pieces together, I was hesitant to pound on a tree or make a whoop back, because my inherent fear was that I'd potentially draw them in. And then what would I do? We were on our way out, and we weren't coming back. Let's just leave quietly. But I couldn't help checking over and over to see if it was still there. It seemed to be content just watching us. With the last bag taken to the car, I only had to make a quick look around inside before locking up. As I made my way for the front door and pulled it shut, I turned around, locking eyes on the subject in question. As I stepped down and turned towards the car, it moved. It wasn't a tree stump. I could now see a side profile of an enormous head that was turning away and back toward the stream. It seemed smooth and graceful as it stood up, walking slightly away and finally disappearing into the bushes. My best guess, I'd have to say, was that it was at least 6 feet tall, if not slightly more, but the shoulders were easily a foot wider than mine. The body, and what I could see of the arms, looked thick. I've been an assistant football coach in college and also played in high school. I think my ability to perceive size was in fact quite accurate. Its shape kind of reminded me of the build of a football player with shoulder pads on. This one was not the owner of the print, though, that I found by the stream, which means there was at least one more. Maybe the smaller one made the sounds as I opened the tailgate yesterday. My main objective was to get the family safely out of this place. I walked quickly to the car and we got out of there. An hour ago, I felt pretty drained from lack of sleep, but not anymore. Now, my adrenaline was pumping. Once we pulled out on the main road, there'd be no looking back. As I mentioned earlier, I'm friendly with the owner of the cabin, and whenever we cross paths, I struggle with the thought of telling him what I saw. Last time we talked, he mentioned adding another cabin on the opposite side of his property, and all I could do was nod my head and say, "Great!" The picture is absolutely horrible and inconclusive, I'll admit that. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have probably deleted the pictures. I've cursed myself for not bringing a real camera, but I saw it turn its head and then get up and walk away, and I'll never forget that moment, and what a great sense of relief that nothing bad happened. Once we made it home, there was just one last thing I needed to do. "Hi, Mom. I know it's been years, but do you remember where that box of Bigfoot books might be?" "Okay, I'll stop by after dinner."